Hi, this is me again. And today I wanted to talk about people's mindset, the social psychology, and what's up with people. I think I've been talking about social perception and about people trying to portray us as things that we're not. And why do I say things? Because sometimes I think we're minimized as things, but we're going to get into it. But for your content, I'm going to be taking or reading some chapters about this book for you to know. You have it right here to have some kind of reference. And I love this type of things. It says, this page intentionally left blank. Sometimes I would like to intentionally left my mind blank. That is specifically for overthinkers as well. So take it as you want. And we also talked about the self before, and that is where this book comes from. I mentioned that this book talks about different things about social perspective, but it also includes things about us as individuals. So that's why I want to continue this part, and I also wanted to encourage you to be conscious about your type of mindset. Like, what do you think as you think, and what do you think people think in a certain way? It could be like a tongue twister if you want to like it, but the human mind is a tongue twister itself. So that's why I want to continue with understanding people. We were talking about the self, but what is the self if we don't even understand who we are? To start with, I think the self is just like a more complex topic to speak to, because it's more like getting inside not only our brains but our inner self. That is where we can get like rounds and rounds and rounds of theory, political, academical articles if we want. Everyone perceive what they want to perceive in a different way. So that is why the complexity doesn't rely on why and how the things are as they are, but because of the eyes of the person who is perceiving those things. That is why it is so complex sometimes. So understanding people, social psychologists have sometimes seen their task as understanding situations and understanding minds. Yet we think that understates the value of social psychology. It is interesting that they use the word understates instead of understands. So I will continue. You probably were not inspired to become a social psychologist to learn about situations. That's right. On the contrary, most people come to social psychology because they are interested in people, as we are right now. Social psychology is to study and think endlessly about people. Experiments in social psychology test hypotheses about people. Our field has plenty to say about people because it is based about what? People. Most studies in social psychology proceed in very small steps. There were a few experiments aimed at some narrow aspect of human functioning. Yet underlying those studies are broad assumptions about what types of creatures people really are. Who we are, I mean. I think there isn't like a general definition of it. It is always like either physical, it is always in terms of evolution, critical thinking, literature, or others, but that's why we have like different definitions for certain words and concepts. We cannot even rely on one thing for a single definition of an item or even a word. I have different definitions for the same word. I think that is like a great example of a reflection of who we are. We are like a bunch of things, but at the same time, even being ourselves, being who we are, we cannot even describe properly in few words our species and things around us. It's a great reflection of it. We tend to use same or very similar words to explain different type of things, and that happens with ourselves. So who we are, or better say, what are we? But I'll continue because we want to find out. So when we introduce the field, we offer a somewhat like bitter taste of this kind of images about humankind as social psychology has imagined them. So something about this is that this type of information, how we describe ourselves, has something to do with different types of behaviors and different types of ways of learning. But we can go on through the history of social psychology, but I really want you to know more about it, but specifically about certain topics that I think that are important. So let's start with social cognition. So the approach of it is like some kind of a discipline as a whole, but as a sub-area as well. Social cognition encompasses new approaches to classic research on attribution theory, how people explain behavior and events. So this is the sauce we were looking for. Impression formation, how people form impressions of others. Stereotyping, that's a pretty good one, and I could go on in a single video about it. How people think about members of groups. Attitudes, how people feel about various things. And self, I love talking about the self, how people think about themselves. I think it is very important to recognize ourselves in this particular moment and time and sphere. What simply just gets these areas together are their emphasis on the social implications of people's thoughts and subjective perceptions of reality. As I mentioned before, perceptions. This is really, really important, because what you could be learning right now, it isn't going to be the same information the other people that is watching this video will be having in their heads. Such work fell outside of the mainstream from the 1920s to the 1950s, when behaviorism dominated the field of psychology with an ideology that emphasized objective stimuli and behaviors, while actually also getting into the area of cognition. But it has been more in vogue since the cognitive revolution of the 1960s, and especially since the social cognitive revolution of the 1980s. So, I don't know if you noticed, but throughout the years, they just been adding like more specifications to the concept itself, which I loved. However, the cognitivism of modern social cognition differs from that underlying early work in attribution, impression formation, and similar areas. Today's approaches to these issues rely heavily on concepts, theories, and methods borrowed by or from the field of cognitive psychology, a discipline that has existed only since about 1967. And that is something that they tend to give like as a subject. And I think when you take psychology, you usually take like 1 or 2 subjects about cognitive psychology. When I was in college, it was like that. So you tend to take like subjects about all the disciplines of a main career itself, but of course you cannot just miss the practical part. But this one, it is important nowadays. So it is subject itself in different colleges right now. In contrast, earlier work necessarily employed concepts, methods, and theories created by social psychologists, especially for the domains of interest. For example, balance theory explains some aspects of attitude change and interpersonal attraction by posting about mental concepts that were stable and how you perceive relations among them in positive and unstable when the product is negative. If you want me to talk just about the balance theory, let me know. But this balance principle successfully predicted some phenomena, but applied only within a very limited context and relied on a mathematical algorithm that was not generally employed by other psychological theories. Something about psychology and mathematics is that mathematics are exact. Human brains are not. So sometimes we tend to categorize certain things and we tend to get results about numerical outbounds, but we cannot even comprehend ourselves fully. So we actually wanted so bad at some point in history to psychology to be a science. So we wanted to actually link mathematics and psychology together, as it was like a point that they just wanted to do it no matter what. How it was like the outcome of it, they just wanted to do it yes or yes. But how do you put like personality equals less personality plus minus attitude? How do you do that? So it's very, or I see like something like difficult. So then some methods, what they started to do is to do like a lot of research, trying to do a lot of scientific investigations, not trying to categorize as numerical the main aspects of the brain, because that would have been like something very difficult to do and unpredictable, something that mathematics needs. They need situations that could be predictable with numbers. That is what it is for, and in order to comprehend certain aspects of life. So since they couldn't do that in full, they just started just launching lots and lots of investigation with study groups, people that just had like the sample. They just apply some kind of test. They did a lot of interviews sometimes, and with situation or those type of tests, they could get some kind of approach in percentages, graphics that could actually have some numerical assets on it, and that could have finally things that you can generalize, and I put that in quotes, in order to find similar solutions in other researchers around the globe with similar scenarios. So that is what we've been doing, or what people in the academic field has been doing. But proponents of social cognition apply their enthusiasm for cognitive psychology to their own research on attribution, as I mentioned before, impression formation, stereotype and attitudes, and the self, generating research programs that extend an earlier work in those areas in new directions, as we just talked about. So social cognition is an approach. What is that about? So the philosophies and practices, particularly new social cognition, quickly just went into a perspective that some view as revolutionary, like its discipline has its peak, right? So when something is new, is going to be like a bomb between the people that is related to that discipline or field, until they make like a lot of researches and stuff into that field, and then it's like, okay, now it's more common. So we need to examine everything. We need to try and test processes. We need to measure things. Things that can be measurable are pretty valuable, because you can take samples of it, and samples means like some kind of closer look to be something that you could replicate in the future. So just all in there. So practically, when we talk about social conditions, is that they wanted, or when you wanted to apply beyond the borders of the discipline itself, it was like something pretty hard to do. But they wanted to do all of that in order to give the recognition they deserved. So there's always going to be like a conflict between old and new approaches. So it is something that you cannot avoid. Once you are discovering something, some people are going to be against something you will be discovering. So take that into account. If you're doing some kind of project, essay, whatever, you will always find like people against, or different opinions, contrasts, etc. But that is also valuable because, for example, with social connection, when it was in its peak, you had this type of different opinions that creating contrasts, and then people were just researching more to see if those contrasts, different opinions, and different outcomes were right. So it was something valuable. And that is when different theories and models were created. The ones that were tested the most, one of the ones that were tested the most were like the models, because at some point we wanted to build that thing that could be replicated. So as I mentioned before, that is something really, really valuable. But aside from that, I want to talk to you about other things in the area. So, for example, we love to do like the graphics per se, but now we're going ahead and we're going to talk about the self. If humans evolved from great apes, why are human cells so much more elaborate than those of apes? I really love this question, and I want to carry it with me. This sure is why it could be printed. By talking serious, of course, for some people this will be like a question that could be easily replied to, but it isn't like a question to be answer rapidly. It is for you to say like, yeah, because of evolution, right, for example. But why? Like, can you spell like the processes behind it? What happened in our brains that it actually, yes, we face an evolution phase. I almost said evolutionary, but the evolution was evolutionary itself even today, right? Of course, we don't have that brains anymore from thousands and thousands of years ago. But what happened with the perception of self during that time? So, rather, the self is an essential part of the interface between the animal body and the social system. Human social systems, including culture and civilization, are much more complex than the social system for other great apes. I don't know if you ever had watched Nat Geo. There was like this show about apes or different type of gorillas, how they're interacting with themselves, and they have these social norms social organizations that were like really, really similar to human kind of behavior. So for me, it was watching some kind of neighborhood activity that could be easily found today in an actual neighborhood. So they wanted to protect themselves, but they all want to protect themselves as groups. They also had like different groups, and when someone was messing around with one of them, the group was going there and they wanted to protect the person that being affected by the character that wasn't integrated in the group previously. So it's like, this reminds me of secondary school, for example, when you start like being part of a group, and then when other people approaches that group, they look at that person as something like weird, like, what are you doing here? You don't belong here. Not even saying a word, but your facial expressions already communicates that. So I said to myself, like, okay, this is really interesting. So go ahead, try to channel Nadio. Let me know what you think. But yeah, the human self has to have capabilities and properties that enable it to deal with this and lots of other social systems. So we talk about the name, that your name is not part of your brain, although your brain has to be able to know and use the name. That is how we identify between ourselves and our social groups. We still have needs as humans, but we've been added so much things, so many more social norms and suitable behaviors in order to adapt to different contexts, that sometimes I think that at this point we just are missing a bit the point. But we've been added so much things that of course contributed with a new perception of the self today. So let's talk about this history of the self. So it has like an old history, but we can talk about around 1950s. So at the time, psychology was dominated by two widely different paradigms. One was behaviorism, which took a different view of selfhood. Behavior in that view was a product of reinforcement histories and situational contingencies. That is when we have like all these experiments that could be cruel nowadays with animals. If you can picture that in your brain, there was little room for self-esteem, identity crisis, or black box, invisible entities such as the self. The other dominant view was the psychoanalysis. I did not quite talk about the self, but they find it useful to talk about the ego. Theory of that discipline as the weak servant of two powerhouse masters. And that the instinct drives in the ID and the socialized guild agent called the superego, which internalizes society's rules. The ego, which can be seen as the early theory of self, was a rather pathetic creature trying to carry out the often contradictory demands of these two masters, and after severe constraints of the external world. To be sure, after Freud died, there was a movement to actually arise his theory, so to give like more respect and assign more autonomous power to the ego. So actually this just was trying to increase research and attention to the study of the ego, although the term self gradually supplanted the term ego. So we went from ego back in the day to self. Interest in the self escalated rapidly in the 1960s and 1970s. Quite likely this was fueled by the Sitgist, which was dominated by useful rebellion against the establishment and its rules for who to be and how to act. People were trying to raise their voices during this time, and they have always been trying to do that, but I know like the peace movement was like escalating a lot during this time. So this makes sense. By the late 1970s, social psychologists had begun to study many phenomena loosely associated with the self. If you know more about the historical facts related to these times, let me know and how it can contribute to this. Because of course this is from a psychological perspective, is the one that I know. So if someone can just addition the historical part that could contribute to this, that will be amazing. And by the late 1970s, social psychologists had begun to study many phenomena loosely associated with the self. Incorporating ideas and methods pertinent to the self proved useful in research. And so the evidence accumulated, as I mentioned before, more research, more chances to replicate something, more theories, and more approaches to the well-known and desirable science field. His list of addresses of the so-called self-interest grew rapidly, expanding to include hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of researchers who wanted to be kept abreast of the latest work. Since then, the interest in self has remained a strong theme of social psychology, and I think psychology itself, to be honest, although the continuity is misleading. The study of self is a large tent containing many other ideas of study, and these have watched and over the years. As an incomplete list, consider these terms of self-affirmation, self-appraisal, self-awareness, that is really popular nowadays though, self-concept, self-deception, self-defeating behavior, self-enhancement, self-esteem, another pretty popular one, self-evaluation maintenance, that is interesting, self-interest, self-monitoring, self-perception, that is an interesting one too, self-presentation, self-reference, self-regulation, self-serving biases, self-verification, and others. So what? In the middle 1990s, faced with the task of producing an integrative overview of research on the self, I searched long and hard for a single core phenomenon or basic book of selfhood, one that could serve as a useful framework for discussing all the work social psychologists had done. He failed. Instead, I reluctantly concluded that at least three important types of phenomena provided three basic roots of selfhood. We already mentioned the first one, that is consciousness turning around towards itself, which is called reflexive consciousness. For example, you might think about a recent experience of success or failure you have had, including its implications for what possibilities the future may hold for you. You might seek to learn more about yourself by reading your horoscope, by weighing yourself, by timing yourself running a mile, or by taking a magazine quiz. After an accident, you might check your body systematically for injuries. You might read about something that someone did and wonder whether you could do such a thing, whether it be climbing a mountain, learning to paint, shooting someone, or winning a prize. All these processes involve how the self is aware of itself and builds a stock of knowledge about itself. Perfect. That will be reflexive consciousness. So the second basis of selfhood is interpersonal relationship, and for me it's one of the most complicated ones. The self functions to create sustained relationships, to fulfill important roles, and to keep a favorite position in the social system. We want to adapt. That is one of the main key purposes of our brain. We're already pre-programmed for that. But, for example, of the interpersonal aspect of self would include getting dressed up for an interview, date, or ceremony, changing your behavior to live up to someone else's expectations, and competing against a rival. You might feel embarrassed on finding that someone has been watching you. You may tell private personal stories to help a new romantic partner get to know you. You may take on a new identity by joining a group or getting a job. All this involves the self being defined by how it is connected to others and to its efforts to make those relationships strong and satisfying. What do you think about this? I think we are fit on the picture. And the third and final basis of selfhood is making choices. That's another difficult one. You know what made me study psychology? I wanted to know what we decide. I wanted to know the reasons or the causes behind the decision. Why do we pick A instead of B? Why do we choose color green instead of color blue, for example? So the decision making, if one of the things that have been researched the most, I might say, in psychology, I might say as well. So you might receive temptation so as to be true to your diet, wedding vows, or religious beliefs. You decide what to major in or where to live. You choose your goals and then work towards them, even when you might not feel like doing so. You vote, you borrow money and pay it back. You make a promise to a friend and then keep it, and so forth. All this show the self at work, facing and making decisions, following through on previous commitments, and exerting control over itself. But what about self-knowledge? And that will be another video, because I really want to dig into this. That is when we're going to be the subcategories of self-awareness, self-concepts in general. And I know you will love it, because we have like the most famous ones, and that is used for marketing purposes, coaches, and more. That there's like, what about your self-esteem? You need to be awake. What about being self-conscious? What about productiveness? What about self-esteem? What about all the type of self that we mentioned before? But they use it for other purposes, right? So I want you to know exactly what that is, and to recognize it when someone is telling you something, because that is what it's being used for nowadays, is to sell you something. We're in a period of time that everything it's on sale at some point. So even those material concepts are being used to that, for those purposes. Do we even know them? Do we even know why their definition is? The deep constitution of it for each one of them. After hearing all of this, I would say like no. But somehow we have consumed at least like 10 to 15 videos in the last months about some kind of self-awareness, self-esteem, self-consciousness, self-perception, self-image, self. But we didn't even know what the self was, right? What do you think is the self for you? Not after hearing everything, like at the beginning. What did you think the self was? And now what do you think it is? The purpose of the video is for you to get information then that you can contrast with the things you watch online. and especially for people to sell you stuff and to use like in their favor. And I'm talking that this is bad, but it's just for you to be contrasting theories and things, because it is good not only to consume content just to consume, but to also to identify when you hear something like, hey, I remember I heard this before, like self-esteem, what is it about? And why am I resonating or related to something this person said? For example, someone at the gym that wants to increase their self-esteem is doing exercise, right? And then it's selling me a training program. That training program might be good. Or the person that is selling me a journal to be self-conscious about my time, that might be good too. But now you can be familiar to those concepts. Now when someone tells you like self-esteem, self-awareness, you say like, okay, this means this. So then you can continue, okay, go ahead, tell me what you want to say on this TikTok, on this reel, and everything in between, to a friend or a family member. What do you want to go to? Because I heard this woman telling me about this. So go ahead, I'm listening to you. I'm listening. So I will stop here because I think I then will proceed with the second part on the same video, but I want to give it my full time right now. I need to sleep, but I enjoy making this kind of conversational type of footage, because I take it always like a conversation with someone. That's why it's so casual. And hope you can have a nice day, afternoon, evening, night, wherever you're at. So see you in another time. Bye bye.